Good morning, everyone. I'm Rachel Reynosa, Senior Editor at People Matters. We're excited to bring you this webinar in partnership with Indeed. Today, we'll be talking about Singapore's recruitment landscape in 2022. With Singapore's economic recovery, recruiters are facing new challenges in trying to hire talent with in demand skills. To aid talent leaders in creating the most effective hiring strategies, People Matters and Indeed are leading this session packed with the latest recruitment insights. Joining us today is Callum Pickering, APAC economist at Indeed. Callum is an economist at the Indeed Hiring Lab, and he focuses on the Asia Pacific region. His work is largely involving labor market research and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us, Callum. Let me quickly share a little bit more about People Matters and Indeed. With over 350,000 users, People Matters is Asia's largest and the world's fastest growing digital community platform focused on the space of people and work. Indeed is the number one job site in the world with over 250 million unique visitors each month. With a mission to help people get jobs, Indeed offers employers products and solutions to help them hire the best talent. The company also has a hiring lab, which includes a team of economists and researchers dedicated to delivering insights that help drive the global labor market conversation. They produce research on labor market topics using Indeed's proprietary data and publicly available sources. Before we move forward, I request our audience to let this be an engaging session and to share your views in the chat section on the right side of your screen throughout the discussion. Also, please share your questions for Callum in the Q&A tab. All set? Over to you, Callum.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel, and good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. Today, we're going to be discussing Singapore's labour market and the unique insights that we are seeing on the Indeed platform. We'll also be discussing some major labour and economic trends that will shape recruitment over the year ahead. The demand for workers in Singapore improved considerably throughout 2021, despite some economic outcomes that have been a little bit mixed due to the pandemic. Singapore finished the year on a strong note, though, and we can be optimistic about Singapore's economic outlook. We expect the Singapore labour market to tighten in 2022, with the unemployment rate falling further due to strong job creation across most industries and occupations. This is broadly consistent with what Indeed is seeing across a range of other markets. The biggest challenge, besides dealing with COVID, of course, is the need to boost immigration to help Singapore businesses deal with skill shortages and recruitment difficulties. And those difficulties have become exacerbated over the course of 2021, and we anticipate that they could become a little bit worse over the course of 2022. So let's begin with a look at some recent labour market developments. Now, this graph here shows the employment impact of the pandemic against the Asian financial crisis beginning in 1998 and the dot-com bubble beginning in 2001. What is immediately apparent is that the job losses during the pandemic were much larger in size and occurred more rapidly than in previous recessions. At the end of 2021, employment was still 3.7% below its peak in December 2019. The employment recovery from the Asian financial crisis took almost 2 years, while for the dot-com bubble it took around 3.5 years. The pandemic job recovery has already started, but we don't know how long it's going to take. For some countries, it's been quite rapid, while for others, it most certainly hasn't. There is good reason to believe that Singapore probably fits into the latter category. It may take a while for Singapore employment to return to its pre-pandemic peak. And that's largely because of population. So in the 2020-21 financial year, Singapore's population fell by 4.1%. It is by some margin the largest decline we've seen in the past 70 years. While every category fell, around 3/4 of the overall decline was driven by the almost 11% fall in Singapore's non-resident population. Singapore's population has now fallen for the past 2 years by a total of 4.4%, and it's now at its lowest level in 8 years. So the past 2 years, the decline in the past 2 years has completely offset the population growth that we saw in the preceding 6 years. Now, a key question for the employment outlook, and certainly one that recruiters are thinking about a lot, is how quickly can Singapore turn this around? Now, the answer to that question, and right now no one has a firm answer, will go a long way to determining Singapore's economic performance over the next few years. It will be difficult for the Singapore economy to grow at a strong rate through 2022, 2023, 2024, unless population begins to turn around, unless immigration flows begin to return to something that better resembles normal. Now, due to the decline in population, Singapore's unemployment rate has remained low throughout the pandemic, contributing to the skill shortages that have become increasingly common. Singapore's unemployment rate eased to 2.4% in the December quarter, after peaking at 3.5% in September 2020. Before the pandemic began, the unemployment rate was 2.3%. So we're basically back to where we were before the pandemic began, despite all the job losses that have occurred. For the resident population, the unemployment rate is a little bit higher at 3.2%, but once again, it's back to around where it was before the pandemic began. Government policy, such as generous wage subsidies and the job incentive scheme, have supported Singapore employment throughout the pandemic, helping to keep the unemployment rate low throughout this obviously very challenging time. Now, one consequence of Singapore's low unemployment, as well as the falling population and the growing demand for workers, has been an increase in Singapore's employment rate. A country's employment rate is the share of the eligible population that is employed. In Singapore, the employment rate for residents has increased for every age group during the pandemic. So a larger share of each of these age groups is now employed compared with before the pandemic. The increase has been quite pronounced among younger people, those aged 15 to 24, as well as Singapore's population over the age of 65. The increase has been particularly large among women, higher than for men for almost every single age group. Quite simply, there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and increasingly that needs to be done by Singapore residents, because we just saw the sharp fall in the non-resident population. And so that's driving the Singapore employment rate to record levels. It's never been higher, encouraging some people to enter the workforce for the first time, or to return to the workforce, or to delay their retirement. And obviously we're seeing a lot of people sort of extend their careers past traditional retirement age with that 65 and plus age group there. The pandemic impact on the service sector was sharp and immediate. Job losses peaked in September 2020. The impact on the goods industry, though, was slow. It ramped up gradually, with employment reaching its low point in September 2021. The best way to explain this is that the service sector is particularly sensitive to economic restrictions, and hence that immediate impact. As soon as we locked things down, the service industry started to cut jobs, right? They really had no choice. Whereas for goods industries, and we're mainly talking about manufacturing and construction, they're more sensitive to a recession or downturn. These industries have been gradually worn down by 2 years of lower economic activity than otherwise would have occurred. And so those job losses in these industries have sort of mounted up over time. The pandemic was initially a crisis of service industries. Today, it's more a crisis of manufacturing and construction, particularly when you remember that these two industries account for around a quarter of Singapore's employment, but more than half of the decline in overall job losses throughout the pandemic. Now, despite the overall decline in employment, some industries have still managed to thrive, namely tech, financial services, public administration, healthcare, and professional services. When you look at the employment profile for these industries, you'd swear that the pandemic never happened. These industries just didn't really suffer job losses at any point over the past 2 years. Then we have some industries where conditions are a bit mixed. Some have partially recovered, or perhaps they took a bit of a step back during last year's restrictions. These include food and beverage services, retail, and transportation. And finally, we have sectors that are still struggling. These are industries where employment has been falling for the best part of 2 years. These include manufacturing, construction, wholesale trade, accommodation, and real estate. Now, some of these struggling industries took their first steps on the road to recovery in the December quarter, so at least they finished the year on a stronger note. But the past 2 years for those industries has been, quite the struggle. In the past 2 years, employment outcome for Singapore residents have varied considerably by education. If you have a university degree, then employment prospects have been fantastic. Basically, every booming industry in Singapore has a high concentration of university graduates. Employment outcomes for people with diplomas or other professional qualifications has been quite strong as well. But for those residents with a secondary education or lower, it's been a pretty tough job market, and it remains that way. Most of the struggling or mixed industries have a large cohort of workers without formal tertiary qualifications. Overall, the Singapore economy is now 3.6% larger than it was before the pandemic began. The economy expanded by 2.3% in the December quarter, with the economy rebounding strongly during the second half of the year after economic restrictions weighed heavily on activity throughout the first half. Overall, the Singapore economy in 2021 was 7.6% larger than in 2020. The expectations for 2022 suggest that we'd be looking at growth maybe in the 3 to 5% range, which would be a pretty good outcome given the issues that we've seen with population, which is always a driving factor behind economic activity. Now, in this section, I'll highlight some of Indeed's data and some of the major trends that I think are worth remembering. Now, the first one I wanted to focus on was the rapid growth in hiring. So, how many Singapore jobs are available on Indeed? Well, the answer is a lot more than there were before the pandemic began. At the end of January, job postings on Indeed were tracking 93% higher than on February 1, 2020. That is, before the pandemic really took hold. Postings surged over the second half of the year after softening a little during the phase 2 lockdowns during May and June. Postings have been above pre-pandemic levels since October 2020. Singapore job creation compares favourably with other major markets that Indeed operates in. That small table there in the corner shows how postings are tracking in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And at 93%, Singapore is outperforming each of them to varying degrees. Strong job creation is a great sign of future employment. It's a sign that the Singapore labour market is well placed for recovery and that the unemployment rate is likely to fall further. It also indicates that businesses are confident in Singapore's economic outlook and direction. Recruitment activity, though, varies considerably across different occupations, reflecting the uneven impact that the pandemic has had. Overall, though, most occupation groups are doing pretty well. Postings for production occupations, which includes manufacturing, are up almost 150% compared with before the pandemic. Engineering, installation and maintenance, tech and construction roles are all more than double pre-pandemic levels, and they're all higher than the national average. Now, part of the reason hiring in manufacturing or construction is so strong is because they need to bring new staff on board to replace those earlier job cuts. As I noted earlier, from an employment standpoint, those two industries have struggled, and thousands of people have lost their jobs throughout the pandemic. Okay, and when that's the case, as these industries begin to recover, as activity picks up, they now need to rehire those lost staff. And so that's contributing to this very strong recruitment activity. Other occupational groups, such as tech, not only have strong hiring activity, but also never suffered major job losses. So recruitment activity here reflects nothing more than the strong and ever growing demand for tech skills. So there are different factors that are driving strong hiring activity. Okay, and understanding how these industries or occupations were impacted by the pandemic goes a long way to understanding what is the major driving factor behind these hiring patterns. As I said, for production, construction, it's job losses. For something like tech, it's just the ongoing strong demand for these types of workers. Now, overall, job postings for every occupational group is well above pre-pandemic levels. So in other words, there is a lot of competition for talent across the board. And that's obviously great news if you're a job seeker, but it's created a pretty challenging situation for recruiters. And one of the reasons why it is so challenging is because Singapore's population has fallen considerably. So just returning to this graph again, just to remind you, because I think this is a really important point and something that's very important to understanding Singapore's economic and labour market outlook. As I said earlier, in the 2020-21 financial year, Singapore's population fell by 4.1%. And as I said, it's the largest decline in population in the past 70 years. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this graph, but the combination of record recruitment on one hand and a falling population on the other is far from ideal for recruiters. It's a recipe for hiring difficulties and skill shortages and creates a more difficult recruitment environment, particularly for businesses that rely on overseas talent. Now, focusing on the resident population, so ignoring non-residents for a moment. The population aged 15 to 34 has fallen 3% since 2019. That's going to be pretty rough on industries such as retail, hospitality, arts and recreation that historically rely on younger workers. And it's not doing any better among the 35 to 54 age group, down 3.9%. The one age group that is growing is the 65 and over cohort. That's up 9.9%. Quite simply, Singapore has an aging population, and that can be challenging for policymakers to deal with. This also highlights the importance of immigration for Singapore's long-term economic success. Most immigrants that come to Singapore are going to fit in that 15 to 35, maybe even the 35 to 54 age brackets. Okay, and that helps to deal with the aging population. It's going to be difficult for businesses to thrive and recruiters to source talent in an environment where the population in key demographics is on the decline. I think opening borders, aggressively going after foreign talent is going to be really important for Singapore's economic well-being over the next few years. And there's obviously a lot of uncertainty in that space, and we don't know what's going to happen with border closures, not just in Singapore, but in other countries as well. But I think it is very important for Singapore to be aggressive on that front as the world, learns to live with COVID and as we begin to recover from the pandemic. The third thing I wanted to note was Singapore's changing job composition. So a consequence of the pandemic is that the job mix in Singapore is quite different than it was before the pandemic began. This table shows the occupations with the largest increase and decrease in their overall posting share since February 1 last year. The strongest gains have been in scientific research and software development. Before the pandemic, scientific research accounted for just 1.6% of Singapore job postings. Now that's increased to 3.4%. Software development has jumped from 11.4% of Singapore postings to 12.8%, an increase of 1.4 percentage points. Software development is now the second biggest category for job postings, only slightly behind management roles. Now, if some jobs are increasing their share, then others must also be declining. And that's what we've got on the right-hand panel there. Today, Singapore is creating relatively fewer jobs in sales, accounting, and manufacturing than you'd expect based on historical trends. Sales, for example, has declined from 10.2% of postings to 8.7% of postings, a decline of 1.5 percentage points. Now, there is still a lot of competition for talent in sales, or management, or accounting, but these occupations have underperformed the broader recruitment recovery thus far. And it'll be interesting to see whether these are trends that persist, even as Singapore further removes itself from the pandemic, or whether these are trends that continue to persist. Now, a fourth trend is the rise in remote work. And I imagine that's something that we're all very familiar with at this point in time. By the end of January, 10% of Singapore job postings on Indeed were remote jobs. That is, they explicitly mention phrases such as work from home or work remotely in their job descriptions. The remote posting share rose sharply during Singapore's initial lockdown in 2020 and has gradually increased since then. It peaked at 11% of postings in mid-December. Currently, it's 4.4 times higher than was considered normal before the pandemic began. Now, our measure of remote postings isn't going to capture every remote job. There are going to be jobs that can be performed remotely that aren't explicitly noting that in their job descriptions. So I like to think of Indeed's measure of remote postings as more sort of the absolute minimum of what's potentially out there. But I think this is a useful way of looking at how things have changed and how they don't appear to be returning to normal. Now, of course, the national average doesn't show the full picture. Take media and communications and marketing, for example. 18.2% of job postings in the second half of 2021 were remote job opportunities. That's up from the low 2% range before the pandemic began. Even roles that favoured remoteness before the pandemic, such as IT operations and software development, have experienced a pretty large increase in remote job opportunities. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, there is a range of occupations where remote work just isn't viable. And so the remote posting share hasn't changed much, probably close to 0% before the pandemic and pretty close to 0% over the past 6 months. But for most occupations, there has been a sizable increase in the share of job opportunities that are remote based. Now, the longer these trends persist, and as I said, there aren't really any signs that we're returning to normal, the greater the likelihood is that it has a more permanent impact on our offices and our cities and the way we go about our work. We can only really speculate about what post-pandemic work looks like, but increasingly I think we're probably looking at some sort of hybrid type model for office workers where maybe they work 2 or 3 days at home each week, and maybe they do 2 or 3 days in the office per week as well. The rise in remote work opportunities has been matched by job seeker interest. By the end of January, 2.9% of searches on Indeed were for remote jobs. That's 1 in every 34 searches. It's also 3.8 times higher than was normal before the pandemic began. Now, 2.9% of searches might not seem like a lot until you remember that there are millions of different search terms that job seekers can use to find a job. Remote work is consistently among the most popular search terms in Singapore, and that certainly wasn't true before the pandemic began. If you are recruiting for a role that can be performed from home, it absolutely makes sense to emphasize that clearly in your job descriptions. Right now, it's one of the most effective ways to attract candidates to a role you want to fill. Another trend is that vaccination requirements are becoming more prominent in job descriptions. So, Singapore businesses are becoming more forthright around their expectations for potential workers and their vaccination status. By the end of January, 3.5% of Singapore job postings featured references to vaccine requirements in their job descriptions. It's doubled in the past 4 months and is about 5 times higher than a year ago. Now, of course, there's also going to be a range of jobs where vaccination status will be considered, but which don't include that information explicitly in the job description. And given that Singapore is a high vaccination country, there would be a lot of businesses that would simply assume that those applying have been vaccinated and wouldn't ask explicitly about that until they get to sort of the interview stage of going for the job. The final trend I wanted to touch upon was Singapore's tech sector. The tech sector has come up a few times throughout this presentation because it is a high growth sector and there is a lot going on in there. The tech sector is rapidly evolving, and that's both exciting but can also be challenging for recruitment. In 2021, the tech sector accounted for 17% of job postings on Indeed. That's up from 13.7% 5 years earlier. As I noted earlier, software development is now the second largest occupational category in Singapore, behind only management roles. And I think that really highlights just how common or how high the demand for tech talent is in Singapore at the moment. Tech has consistently shown itself to be one of Singapore's most exciting and fastest growing industries. And Singapore has really established itself as a key tech hub within the Asian region, particularly in recent years. Yet, skill shortages in tech are quite common, often caused by a mismatch between the skills demanded by employers and the skills on offer from job seekers. Traditionally, that has been addressed through skilled migration. Recently, not so much. The tech sector is more susceptible to skill shortages because the skills in demand are changing so rapidly. What's in vogue 2 years ago isn't always so popular 2 years later. And it can be difficult for job seekers to stay on top of the skills that employers want. So what's changed recently? Every occupation on the left-hand side is a job that has become more prominent over the past 2 years. These are jobs that account for a larger share of tech postings compared with 2 years ago. 2 years ago, cloud engineer was the 41st largest tech occupation as measured by the number of job postings on Indeed. In other words, it was a pretty minor tech role. Fast forward 2 years though, and cloud engineer is now the 17th biggest tech role. All right, so it's surged up the rankings within a pretty short period of time. 2 years ago, a lot of people probably hadn't heard of the cloud or cloud engineer as a profession. Now it's relatively common, and a lot of businesses are hiring for that type of role. Then you have, on the other hand, then you have roles such as computer engineer and IT architect that 2 years ago weren't in the top 200 largest tech roles, but today are ranked 47th and 63rd respectively. They're not large tech roles by any means, but they're certainly a lot bigger than they were 2 years ago, right? And given their upward momentum, there's a good chance they end up higher on those rankings in the years to come. On the other hand, we have web developer. 2 years ago, it was the 18th biggest tech role, but today it's fallen to 45th. Or network engineer, which has fallen from 12th to 19th. There have been some pretty big changes within a short period of time. And Singapore's tech sector will continue to evolve. And 2 years from now, we will inevitably have some relatively unknown jobs that become incredibly popular, and vice versa. So we've discussed a lot today, you know, and we've gone through it reasonably quickly. There's a lot of slides that I've gone through, which I probably could spend, 15, 20, 25 minutes just discussing some of the, various components and some of the issues. But I hope you found the discussion interesting. Here are some closing thoughts, as well as some strategies for hiring in a very challenging labour market. Demand for talent is incredibly high right now across Singapore. It's as high as we've ever seen, with postings elevated across almost every occupation and industry. Strong demand for workers, combined with a declining population, has caused the Singapore labour market to tighten considerably. Talent is harder to find, and recruiters need to adjust their strategies accordingly to attract more people and broaden their search for talent. A tight labour market, though, is great for job seekers. It gives them more bargaining power to ask for higher wages or better conditions, or the ability to work remotely. It gives them more choice in where and how they work. This is the most favourable job market for job seekers in a long time. And from a recruitment perspective, you need to be aware that those dynamics have shifted, that they really have shifted in favour of the job seeker. Finally, there is still a lot of uncertainty. We didn't anticipate the Delta or Omicron variants, and further mutations could obviously undermine Singapore's labour market and economy. We just can't say with any certainty. We hope that we're on the improve. We hope that we're going to emerge from the pandemic and that the recovery will still continue, but we can't say that with any certainty. The outlook for Singapore looks pretty good. I'm certainly optimistic about where Singapore is going over 2022, but we do need to be mindful of those uncertainties. And recruiters will need to be flexible in an uncertain economic environment. A fixed strategy is probably not the right approach, given the uncertainty that businesses are dealing with. Now, here are some simple strategies to deal with a very tight labour market. As I noted earlier, and as I've said throughout this presentation, this is a very challenging environment for recruiters. There's a lot of competition for talent, and there's also a lot of issues and concerns around the labour supply, given what we've seen with the non-resident population. So what are some strategies for recruiting in a tight labour market? Well, the first is that we can pay people more. Higher pay and better benefits is always an excellent way to attract more candidates or retain existing staff, right? From a recruitment perspective, it's not just an issue with finding candidates for the jobs you're looking to advertise, right? You're also probably facing greater challenges in retaining existing staff because there are so many new job opportunities available. So it's relatively easy for existing employees to jump ship to an opportunity that maybe pays a little bit more. Anecdotally, we're already hearing about some pretty big wage or some pretty strong wage competition across the tech space as a range of big employers compete for talent. And I suspect we'll hear more of that across a wide variety of different industries over the coming year. Second, we can search more broadly for new candidates. Now, this could be geographic, such as embracing work from home type arrangements. Depending on the business, it could also involve hiring from other countries. That's always an option for multinational companies that are operating in Singapore. Or it could refer to qualifications or experience. Does a successful applicant require 5 years' experience, or would 2 years be sufficient? Sometimes we create artificial barriers to finding a successful candidate through the requirements we place on a job. In a tight labour market, it makes sense to review those requirements. Right? When the unemployment rate is relatively high, businesses and recruiters can afford to be picky about who they choose for certain jobs. They can't afford to be as picky when the labour market is tight and when competition for talent is so fierce. Third, we can invest more in internal training to develop the skills we need to find. Sometimes the perfect candidate isn't available, but with training, we can turn a good candidate into a great one. And this person could be an external hire or someone already working within our company. And I think this is a really important point when you're looking at Singapore's population dynamics, right? If you can't rely on immigration and non-residents, it makes sense to look at upskilling your existing workers as a way to deal with some of those skill shortages that might be emerging. Finally, we can invest more in employee productivity. A tight labour market breeds innovation and a greater emphasis on creating more productive work processes. Investing in new technology or restructuring teams can help a business work around an inability to fill a particular role. A tight labour market forces us to look at things differently, to try to do things differently. And I think this is as tight a labour market as Singapore has ever seen. I think this is as challenging a recruitment environment as Singapore has ever seen. And so it makes sense for businesses to look at innovative solutions that might help them deal with some recruitment difficulties they might be having for certain roles that they're looking to hire for. And on that note, thank you very much for your time. And I think we'll be opening this up for some Q&A.
Thanks, Callum, for that insightful presentation. I know you mentioned strategies for recruitment in a tight labor market. We have some questions from the audience, particularly about steps to, enhance their hiring process. One of them is about key steps to align the hiring process to the organization's growth target. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my expertise is more in sort of the economic side of things as opposed to the direct recruitment side of things. So I don't want to step too much outside my lane of expertise. I will say this, though, from Indeed's perspective, I think if you are struggling to align the hiring process with your growth targets, if you are finding it particularly challenging to hire for certain roles, or you have unrealistic expectations around what you can achieve from a recruitment perspective, I would certainly recommend having a chat with Indeed and some of our recruitment specialists who actually deal with this on a day-to-day basis, because I'm sure they will have a range of suggestions that can help make your recruitment easier than it currently is.
Thanks, Callum. Another question, perhaps you can delve deeper into the economics of it. What challenges remain in the tech skill demand supply gap? How can organizations overcome them?
Well, that's a great question, and it is very difficult to deal with these challenges in an environment where borders are largely closed and immigration flows remain so low. Singapore's tech sector has long thrived because of Singapore's ability to attract foreign talent and establish itself as a tech hub within the Asian region. And right now, that's obviously compromised to some degree. So there are going to be challenges in the tech space that are just very difficult to deal with while this pandemic is ongoing. One of the things we do see with tech talent, though, is that there is a capacity for a lot of workers in the tech space to upskill themselves and develop different skills that may help to address some of the skill shortages that have become exacerbated throughout the pandemic. So if you can't find an external hire, I would look at your existing workforce and try to identify people within that workforce who can perhaps take on additional responsibilities or perhaps shift their skill set over a little bit to maybe be able to fulfill those roles that you are finding difficult to hire for. It's not a perfect solution, but I don't think there are perfect solutions in the current economic and recruitment environment.
Thank you. Another question from the audience is your insights into why the rate of employment for the 24 to 50 age range is low. Uh, because, after all, that is a key segment of the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question might have just misunderstood that graph just to some degree, and I'll explain why. The graph that I showed about employment rate was how the employment rate has changed compared with 2 years ago. Now, one of the reasons why the employment rate for people in that sort of 24 to 50 age range hasn't increased as much is because it was already very high. And that's in stark contrast to the younger population and also the population over 65, where the employment rate was actually very low before the pandemic began. So what's happened? We've had this very strong demand for workers throughout over the past year. That's bringing people into the workforce, but it's very difficult to bring more people from that 25 to 50 age group because it is already so high, and instead
Hmm.
a lot of people in that young and older bracket are finding opportunities in the workforce that didn't exist 2 years ago. And that's why their employment rate has increased so much.
And then there's a very specific question now. How's the recruitment situation in the contract manufacturing industry this year?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, the manufacturing industry has gone through a lot over the past 2 years. Employment in that industry is well below where it was before the pandemic began. A lot of that has to do with the non-resident population, which is something that manufacturing has utilised quite extensively before the pandemic began, and the inability to tap that source of talent, particularly for those sort of short-term, medium-term contracted positions, has made things quite difficult. Right now, there is a lot of demand for workers in manufacturing space, but it's running into an issue of there aren't enough suitable workers to fill those roles. As I noted earlier, production postings, which includes manufacturing, is up about 150% compared with before the pandemic began. So there's huge demand for manufacturing workers. There just isn't the people who can take on those jobs, and it's going to be difficult to address that until we do begin to see those immigration flows pick up.
Thank you. I just want to throw in this question. You mentioned strong wage competition in the tech sector. What other sectors do you see this trend happening in as well?
Well, given the hiring dynamics we're seeing and very strong demand across the board, there's a strong argument to say that most industries should be facing heightened wage competition over the coming year. In terms of the industries that typically face the biggest skill shortages, I mean, tech is an obvious one. Healthcare is always a big one. Education does also tend to have that as well. Finance and banking is an industry that has typically relied on non-residents as well to address certain skill shortages. It's a popular industry for people outside Singapore to come to the country. So that's also one where we could see issues. And even industries such as manufacturing and construction, who have traditionally relied on non-resident employment, could also face heightened wage competition as businesses compete for, the domestic workforce. These industries haven't always been that popular among domestic workers, but given their inability to tap overseas talent, I think that we will see more wage competition there as well. So my answer is not very specific, because I think you can probably come up with pretty good arguments for a lot of industries having heightened wage competition over the coming year. But I think that makes a lot of sense given the demand and supply factors that are at play.
Thank you, Callum. I guess as my parting shot, um, given the dynamics of the market, the labor market, what would you advise employers in Singapore as regards like, being prepared for these shifts throughout the probably the next 12 months? Even your um, overall take on this.
Well, I think businesses and recruiters need to be really flexible because we are dealing with this very uncertain economic and labour market environment. Things are constantly shifting, policies are shifting. You need to be aware of exactly what's going on from a policy perspective, what's going on with borders. Is there that ability to maybe tap overseas markets a little bit more than we have over the past year? There's going to be a lot of changes, and so offering specific advice is difficult because of that. But I think that just in general, there is that need to be flexible and to ensure that you're aware of everything that is going on and what sort of impact that is going to have on your specific business and the industry that you're operating in.
Okay. Thank you, Callum. So it's generally like keeping their finger on the pulse of the market. So with that, we are going to wrap up today's discussion. Thank you, Callum, for your time and your insights. And a big thank you to our audience for joining us today. We hope you take back with you actionable insights that you can implement in your own organization, in your own industry. Please provide your feedback in the survey link in the chat section. As you know, your input matters. I would also like to thank our partner, Indeed, for helping us develop this session. Stay tuned for other exciting conversations. Again, thank you to Callum. I'm Rachel Renosa. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.